Welcome, dear friends, to Sleep Tale Whispers. I am so glad you're here. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the world outside this quiet space begin to fade away. Tonight, we are going to travel together to a place that exists just beyond the edge of the ordinary world. A place where the air smells of salt and old stone. This is a story for the Hig, a tale woven from moonlight and memory. So, pull your blankets up to your chin, take a deep, slow breath, and let go of the day's burdens. We are going to a lighthouse, but not just any lighthouse. We are going to the Serafina, to an island that holds its breath, waiting for stories to be told. Let your mind grow heavy, and your thoughts drift like seagulls on the tide. This is your time to rest. This is your time to dream. The boatman's name was Silas, and he had not spoken a word in 40 years. This was not a source of sadness for him, nor was it a mysterious affliction. He simply found that the world, especially the world of water and sky, was a place best experienced in silence. Words, he felt, were like stones dropped into a still pond. They disturbed the reflection of the sky. So when the young woman with the sea glass green eyes and the notebook full of questions arrived at the mainland jetty, he merely nodded, took her single canvas bag, and gestured for her to step into his small, sturdy dory. Her name was Elara, and the silence of the boatman was the first strange thing she noticed about this journey. The second was the water itself. It was not the choppy, gray-green water of the open sea she had imagined, but a deep, impossibly clear indigo, so dark it was almost purple, like the juice of crushed blueberries. Through its crystalline surface, she could see, far below, the pale, ghostly shapes of sunken forests, ancient, bleached tree trunks, standing sentinel on the seabed, their skeletal branches reaching up as if yearning for a sun they would never feel again. Silas rowed with a slow, metronomic rhythm, the oars dipping into the indigo, with soft, sucking kisses and emerging with a gentle drip. There was no engine, no creaking of modern machinery, just the rhythmic splash drip, and the cry of a single, circling gull. The island, their destination, grew larger with each passing minute. It was not a large island, more of a dramatic upthrust of ancient rock, capped with a smudge of green and crowned by the lighthouse. The Serafina, it was a structure of pale weathered stone, streaked with rusty orange lichen. It didn't stand stark and new, but seemed to have grown from the rock itself, a natural extension of the cliff. Its tower was stout and powerful, built to withstand 100 furious storms, and at its top, the great lantern room sat like a giant's glass and brass jewel. It was not lit. The Serafina had been decommissioned decades ago, its light replaced by a newer, more efficient one on the mainland. It was a silent giant, keeper of only shadows and echoes now. Elara had come to the island for a reason. She was a cartographer of sorts, but not of land. She mapped stories. Her grandmother, a woman who had spoken in riddles and sang in a language no one else in the family remembered, had grown up on this island, the daughter of the last lighthouse keeper. Before she had passed, she had filled Elara's young head with tales of the Serafina, of a light that could make you remember dreams, of stairs that hummed with the music of the past, and of a tiny, hidden room at the very top of the tower where the keeper could whisper a wish to the stars, and have it echoed back by the sea. Her grandmother called it the Whisper Room. The dory bumped gently against a worn stone jetty, the only man-made structure besides the lighthouse itself. Silas shipped his oars with a quiet thunk, and with surprising agility for his age, hopped onto the jetty, tying the boat to a rusted iron ring. He then offered Elara his hand. His grip was dry and warm, his skin like old leather. He pointed to a steep, winding path that led up through tufts of wiry grass and sea pinks towards the lighthouse door. Then he pointed at himself, and then back at the boat, and then at the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent. He would wait, his gesture said. He would wait for her. Elara nodded her thanks, her voice feeling clumsy in the profound quiet. She shouldered her bag and began the climb. The path was steeper than it looked, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and warm rock, and a sweet herby smell from the crushed foliage under her feet. By the time she reached the lighthouse door, a heavy slab of oak banded with black iron, she was breathless. A large, old-fashioned iron key had been left for her under a particular flat stone. Just as her grandmother's instructions had said, the key turned in the lock with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. The air inside was cool and still, heavy with the smell of dust, old wood, and the faint metallic tang of brass and copper. She stood in a small circular room at the base of the tower. A spiral staircase, made of the same pale stone as the outer walls, curved upwards into the darkness, like the interior of a giant shell. To her right was a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she found the living quarters. It was as if time had stopped. A small iron stove stood in one corner, its door hanging open to reveal a bed of cold grey ash. A simple wooden table sat in the center of the room, with two chairs tucked neatly under it. On the table was a ceramic jug, empty, and a single thick glass tumbler. Against the curved outer wall was a narrow bed, made up with a patchwork quilt of faded blues and greens. The fabric so old it was soft as moss. On a small shelf beside the bed sat a collection of sea glass, smoothed by years of tumbling in the waves. Their colors a muted rainbow, a frosted white, sea green, amber, and a rarer deep cobalt. No kerosene lamp stood on the table. Elara fumbled in her bag, found a box of matches her grandmother had also told her to bring, and lit the wick. A warm, soft glow filled the room, pushing the shadows back into the corners. This, she thought, was where her grandmother had slept as a girl. This was where she had listened to the wind howl and the sea roar, safe in the heart of the stone giant. Elara spent the first hour simply exploring the living quarters. In a small cupboard, she found a tin of hardtack biscuits, a jar of honey that had crystallized into golden sugar, and a tin of tea leaves that still, incredibly, held a faint, smoky scent. She decided to make this her base. The lighthouse proper, the tower itself, could wait until morning. The sun was setting, and the thought of climbing that dark, winding staircase by the light of a small lamp was not appealing. She made a small fire in the stove using kindling and coal. She found in a box beside it, and the boiled water in a blackened kettle. The tea, when she made it, was weak but comforting. She sat at the wooden table, sipping it, listening to the sounds of the island at dusk. The wind had picked up, and it made a low, mournful sound as it curled around the base of the tower. The waves, far below, had a different voice here. A constant, rhythmic shush-shush that was more felt than heard. A deep vibration in the stone itself gives the sound of the earth breathing. As darkness fully claimed the island, Elara blew out the lamp and lay down on the narrow bed. The patchwork quilt was heavy and warm, and it smelled of lavender and dust. She closed her eyes, and the silence of the boatman, the indigo sea, the sunken forest, all swirled together in her mind. She was not afraid. She felt instead a profound sense of being held, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was a faint, high singing, like the whisper of wind through telegraph wires, or perhaps, just perhaps, the echo of a song her grandmother used to hum. It seemed to be coming from above, from the top of the tower. She woke to a world transformed. Sunlight, pale and honeyed, streamed through the small, salt-crusted window of the living quarters. Dust motes danced in the beam like tiny, slow-motion fireflies. Elara felt wonderfully rested, as if she had slept for 100 years. She made more tea, ate a piece of hardtack dipped in the crystallized honey, and felt a thrill of excitement. Today she would climb the tower. The stone staircase was steeper and more worn than she had expected. The center of each step was hollowed out by the footfalls of 100 years of keepers and their families. As she climbed, a small window set into the thick wall at regular intervals offered glimpses of the expanding world. First the rocky slope of the island, then the Indigo Sea, then the Indigo Sea, then the distant hazy line of the mainland. With each step, the air changed. It grew cooler, but also somehow more charged, more alive. The silence of the base gave way to a symphony of subtle sounds. The creak of old timbers in the roof above her, the whisper of Elara moving through unseen cracks, and that faint, singing hum she had heard the night before, growing clearer with every step. The stairs ended at a heavy iron door. This, she knew, led to the lantern room. The door was not locked. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. The light was blinding. For a moment, she could only squint, her eyes adjusting to the brilliance. Then, slowly, the room revealed itself. It was a circular chamber, entirely encased in floor-to-ceiling panels of thick, slightly wavy glass, held in place by a delicate tracery of ironwork. In the center stood the great lens, a colossal, beehive-shaped structure of polished brass and crystal prism. It was silent and still, a dormant giant. Sunlight poured through the glass, catching the prisms and throwing tiny, fragmented rainbows across every surface of the room. The brass fittings, the wooden floor, Elara's own outstretched hands. She walked around the lens, her fingers tracing its cool brass frame. The view from this height was breathtaking. The island was a small, green-brown jewel in an endless expanse of indigo silk. She could see the tiny jetty far below, and Silas Dory, a small dark speck against the stone. She could see the path she had climbed, and the patch of wiry grass where she had picked a sprig of sea pink, and then she saw it. In the floor, almost hidden beneath the massive pedestal of the lens, was a small wooden trapdoor. It was no larger than a book, and it was flush with the floorboards, its edges barely visible. An iron ring was set into it, her grandmother's whisper room. Her heart beating faster, Elara knelt and hooked her finger through the cold iron ring. She pulled. The trapdoor opened with a soft protest, revealing a dark hole and a short, steep ladder leading down. A cool, musty draft, smelling of stone and salt, wafted up. Without hesitation, she climbed down. The room below was tiny, barely large enough for one person to stand in. It was a circular space, directly beneath the lantern room floor, with walls of rough, unadorned stone. A single small slit of a window, more of a gun port really, looked out to sea. There was no furniture, nothing but the bare stone, but it was the acoustics that were extraordinary. As she stood there, catching her breath, she heard the sea with perfect clarity. It wasn't just the sound of waves. It was the sound of the water breathing, the gurgle over submerged rocks, the gentle hiss of foam dissolving on the shore, the deep, resonant groan of pebbles being dragged back by the tide. She could hear it all, layered and distinct, as if she were standing on the seabed itself. And above that, the wind. It didn't just howl, it sang, a complex, shifting melody as it curled around the tower, creating 1,000 different notes as it passed over the stone, the glass, and the iron. And in that perfect resonant chamber, it felt as though any sound she made would be carried out on that wind, over that sea, to the very edge of the world. He understood now. This was where a keeper, alone in a storm, could shout his loneliness into the gale and have it answered by the roar of the waves. This was where a wife could whisper a message of love to a sailor husband far out at sea. Now you might feel it in a sudden, inexplicable warmth in his heart. This was where a child, like her grandmother, could whisper a secret wish to the stars, and the sea would remember it forever. Elara sat on the cold stone floor, her back against the curved wall, and listened. He stayed there for hours, until the sun began its descent, and the light through the slit window turned from gold to amber, to a deep, fiery orange. She didn't feel the cold or the hardness of the stone. She felt only a profound peace, a connection to something vast and ancient. This was the soul of the lighthouse. This was the story her grandmother had tried to give her. When she finally climbed back up, the lantern room was filled with the soft, muted light of dusk. The rainbows were gone. She closed the trapdoor carefully, gently, as if tucking a secret back into its bed. She felt different, changed. The world outside the glass seemed sharper, more vivid, more alive with hidden sound. That night, she didn't sleep in the bed. She gathered her blankets and the patchwork quilt and climbed the dark staircase again. This time, by the light of her kerosene lamp, she opened the iron door to the lantern room, and then the tiny trapdoor. She climbed down into the whisper room, made a nest of her blankets on the stone floor, and lay down, looking up at the dark shape of the great lens above her, visible through the open trapdoor. She listened to the sea, she listened to the wind, and then, softly, she began to whisper. She told the sea about her life in the city, the noise, the crowds, the constant rush. She told it about her grandmother, about her riddles and her songs. He told it about her own loneliness, a quiet, persistent thing she carried with her. She whispered for a long time, pouring her heart into the stone chamber, and the sea and the wind listened. And then, impossibly, they seemed to answer. The rhythm of the waves shifted, becoming slower, more soothing. Like a lullaby, the wind's song softened to a gentle hum, and woven into it, so faint she might have imagined it, was the sound of her grandmother's voice, humming that same familiar tune. A wave of warmth and love washed over her, so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She was not alone. She was held in the memory of this place, in the story of the Serafina, and in the endless whispered conversation between the lighthouse, the sea, and the stars. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, the sound of the ancient world singing her into the deepest, most peaceful slumber of her life. The next morning, she woke to a gray, soft day. The sky was a seamless sheet of pearl, and the sea was the color of old pewter. She climbed out of the whisper room, packed her blankets, and took one last, long look from the lantern room windows. The world was quiet, muffled, waiting. She knew she would have to leave today. Her supplies were low, and Silas would be waiting. She tidied the living quarters, leaving the tin of tea and the jar of honey on the table, just as she had found them. She took only one thing, a single piece of the deep cobalt sea glass from the shelf beside the bed. It was cool and smooth in her palm, the color of the deep ocean. She locked the heavy oak door and placed the key back under its flat stone. The walk down to the jetty was easier this time. The air was still, carrying the scent of coming rain. Silas was there, sitting in his dory, perfectly still, like a figure carved from wood. He looked up as she approached, and for the first time, his weathered face creased into a slow, gentle smile. He didn't ask if she had found what she was looking for. He simply nodded, as if he had known all along. As he rowed them away from the island, Elara turned to watch the Serafina shrink back into the landscape. The lighthouse stood tall and silent on its rocky throne, a guardian of stories. She pressed the cobalt sea glass to her lips. She could still hear it, if she listened carefully. The whisper of the sea, the song of the wind, and the faint, loving echo of her grandmother's hum. Back in the city, life resumed its noisy, hurried pace, but Elara was different. In her pocket, she always carried the piece of cobalt sea glass, and in the quiet moments, on the bus, or just before sleep, she would close her eyes and listen, and she would hear it again. The gentle shush of the indigo sea, the low moan of the wind around the ancient stones, and the profound, peaceful silence of the whisper room. She had mapped the story, yes, But more than that, she had found a place inside herself that was just as vast, just as quiet, and just as full of whispers as the lighthouse itself. And whenever the world became too loud, she knew she could always go back there, to the Serafina, to the island that held its breath, waiting for her to listen. The memory of that place became her own private lighthouse, a steady, silent beam of peace in the sometimes turbulent sea of life. She would often take out the sea glass and hold it to her ear, not expecting to hear the ocean trapped inside, but to feel its cool, smooth weight, a tangible piece of that other world, a reminder that true quiet is not an absence of sound, but a presence of something deeper. It is the sound of stories waiting to be told, of secrets waiting to be whispered, of the soul finally finding a place to rest. And that, dear listener, is the most powerful story of all. It is a story we carry within us, a quiet tale that our own hearts whisper to us when we finally learn to be still. So as you drift off now, let your thoughts drift to your own Serafina. Perhaps it's a real place from your memory, or perhaps it's a landscape you've only visited in dreams. Find that quiet room within yourself, the one with the perfect acoustics for your own soul. Lay down in it, listen to the rhythm of your own breath, the gentle tide of your own heart, and know that you are held, you are safe, and you are part of a story much larger than yourself. Sleep well, dear friends, sleep deep, and let the whispers carry you home. Good night. She returned to the city with the cobalt sea glass warm against her skin, tucked into the small pocket over her heart. The train ride back was a blur of gray fields and tunnel darkness, but Elara saw none of it. Her eyes were closed, her head resting against the window, and in her ears was the gentle, rhythmic shush of the indigo sea. The world of honking cars and rushing commuters felt like a distant memory, a story someone had once told her about a place she used to know. Her apartment, when she finally unlocked the door, felt alien. It was the same collection of second-hand furniture, the same stacks of books, the same view of the brick wall of the neighboring building, but she saw it now through different eyes. The silence here was not the rich, layered silence of the island. It was a dead silence, a silence of absence rather than present. She put the cobalt sea glass on her windowsill, where it caught the weak city light and glowed with an inner fire. It was the only beautiful thing in the room. That night, she tried to sleep in her own bed, but the mattress was too soft, the sounds of the city too jarring. A siren wailed in the distance. A car horn blared. Someone shouted in the street below. Each noise was a small violence against her memory of the whisper room. She tossed and turned for hours before finally, in desperation, she closed her eyes and imagined herself back there. She pictured the rough stone walls, the slit window, the weight of the great lens above her. She imagined the sound of the waves, the song of the wind, and slowly, gradually, the city faded away. She fell asleep with the ghost of a smile on her lips, her hand reaching for the pocket where the sea glass used to be. Weeks passed. The cobalt sea glass remained on her windowsill, a constant reminder. She went through the motions of her life: work, errands, the occasional dinner with friends who asked where she had been, and why she seemed so different. She couldn't explain it to them. How do you describe a color to someone who has only ever seen in shades of gray? How do you describe the sound of a story being told by the sea? She began to change in small ways. She woke earlier, just to watch the sunrise. However pale and obscured by smog it was. She started taking walks in the city's few parks, seeking out the quietest benches, the ones tucked away from the main path. She would sit there and listen, not to the city, but beneath it, searching for the hidden rhythms, the heartbeat of the earth that persisted even here, muffled and forgotten. She found it sometimes in the rustle of leaves, in the distant call of a bird, in the feel of the cool grass beneath her fingers, and she started to write. Not maps of stories, but the stories themselves. She filled notebook after notebook with the tales her grandmother had told her, the ones she had half forgotten. and new ones that seemed to rise from some deep well within her. She wrote about the boatman who had chosen silence over word. She wrote about the sunken forest beneath the indigo sea, imagining a world that had existed before the waters rose, the creatures that had lived among those ancient trees. She wrote about the lighthouse keepers of the Serafina, their loneliness, their joys, their whispered conversations with the wind. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. She wrote in the mornings before work, on her lunch breaks, late into the night by the light of a single lamp. The city noise faded as she wrote, replaced by the rhythms of her own inner sea. The cobalt sea glass on her windowsill seemed to pulse with a gentle light, as if it were keeping time with her heartbeat, with the flow of her pen. One evening, as autumn began to paint the park leaves in shades of amber and gold, she received a letter. It was hand-delivered, pushed under her door, a thick cream-colored envelope with no return address. Inside, on a single sheet of heavy textured paper, was a brief message written in a spidery, elegant hand. Miss Elara, the island has missed you. The whisper room has been waiting. It has new stories to tell, if you are ready to listen. The boatman will be at the jetty on the 1st of November, at dawn. Wear something warm. There was no signature. She didn't need one. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the island itself had sent the message. Or perhaps it was the sea, or the wind, or the memory of all the keepers who had ever stood watch in the Serafina's lantern room. It didn't matter. The call had come, and she would answer. The 1st of November arrived with a sky, the color of pale pearls and air, so cold it seemed to sparkle. Elara was at the mainland jetty before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, a heavy pack on her back filled with warm clothes, more notebooks than she would ever need, and a small tin of her grandmother's favorite tea that she had found in an old shop. Silas was there, of course, sitting in his doorway as if he had never left. He was wearing a thick woolen jumper now, and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He nodded as she approached, and this time she nodded back. Words were still unnecessary. The crossing was different in the cold. The indigo sea looked darker, deeper, more mysterious. A light mist clung to the surface, curling around the boat like the breath of some great sleeping creature. The sunken forest below was barely visible, just ghostly suggestions of pale shapes in the depths. The cold air was so clean, it almost hurt to breathe, but in a good way, a way that made her feel more alive than she had in months. The island rose from the mist like a vision from a dream. The Serafina stood tall and gray against the pale sky, its lantern room a darker smudge at its peak. The seepings were gone now, replaced by tough, wind-sculpted grasses that bent low to the ground. The path up to the lighthouse was slick with dew, and she climbed carefully, her breath clouding in front of her face. The heavy oak door opened with the same groaning welcome. The living quarters were just as she had left them, but someone had been there. A small pile of kindling and coal sat beside the stove. A fresh loaf of bread, still faintly warm, was on the table, wrapped in a linen cloth, and on the shelf beside the bed, where her cobalt piece had been, there was now a piece of sea glass of a color she had never seen before. It was the palest lavender, almost translucent, like a piece of frozen dawn. She lit the lamp, made a fire in the stove, and sat at the table, eating the bread and sipping the tea she had brought. The silence here was different now. It was not the silence of a place waiting to be discovered. It was the silence of a place welcoming her home. She felt no urgency to explore, no need to climb the tower immediately. She was home, and home could wait. She spent the day simply being on the island. She walked its entire perimeter, following the cliff edges where the wind was strongest, and the sheltered coves where the sea lapped gently at small pebbled beaches. She found tide pools teeming with tiny hidden lives, and at moments they looked like flowers, small crabs scuttling under rocks, periwinkles inching along the stone. She sat by one for over an hour, just watching, just listening to the small private sounds of this miniature world. As dusk began to fall, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose that matched her new piece of sea gloss. She climbed the tower. The stone stairs felt familiar under her feet, the hollows in the steps fitting her shoes as if they had been made for her. The iron door to the lantern room opened easily. The great lens was still and silent, but in the dying light, the crystal prisms caught the last colors of the sunset and held them glowing softly, as if the room were filled with captive light. She knelt and opened the small trapdoor. The familiar, musty, salt-scented air rose to meet her. She climbed down into the whisper room, this time bringing a thick woolen blanket to sit on. She settled against the curved stone wall, wrapped herself in the blanket, and listened. And oh, the stories it had to tell. The sea that night was restless, and its voice was strong. It told her of a great storm 100 years ago, when waves had crashed against the tower so high that the spray had reached the lantern room, freezing on the glass and blinding the light for 3 desperate days. It told her of a ship, the Star of the Morning, that had foundered on the rocks at the far end of the island, and of the keeper who had risked his life to pull 3 sailors from the icy water. It told her of the sailors' ghosts who still walked the cliffs on moonless nights, searching for the light that had guided them home. The wind joined in, its voice high and teeming. It told her of the keeper's wife who had stood at this very slit window for 100 nights, watching for her husband's ship to return from a whaling voyage, only to learn he had been lost in the South Seas. It told her of the child who had grown up in this tower, who had learned to read the stars before she could read a book, who had whispered her dreams into this room, and carried across the ocean to a boy on a distant shore who would one day become her husband. Elara's own grandfather! The stones themselves had stories. They spoke in low, rumbling voices of the millions of years they had spent beneath the sea, before some great geological force had pushed them up into the air and light. They told of the creatures that had swum above them, whose fossilized remains were locked in their ancient heart. They told of the first humans who had come to this island, building simple shelters from the very stones that now formed this tower. Elara listened, and she understood. The Whisper Room was not just a place to send your voice out into the world. It was a place where the world sent its voice back to you. It was a place of conversation, of communion, of connection to everything that had ever been and everything that ever would be. She stayed in the room until the stars came out, visible through the slit window as bright, cold points of light, and then the stars began to whisper too. Their voices were so faint, so impossibly distant, that she had to hold her breath to hear them. They told of time, of the vast, unimaginable stretches of years that they had witnessed, of the birth and death of worlds, of the slow, majestic dance of galaxies. They told her that her worries, her fears, her small daily anxieties were nothing in the face of such immensity, and yet they whispered. They mattered, because she was here, a small, conscious part of the universe, capable of listening, capable of understanding, capable of love. And that, the stars seemed to say, was a rare and precious thing. When she finally climbed out of the Whisper Room, her body was stiff with cold, but her heart was warm and full. She looked up at the stars through the glass of the lantern room, and they seemed closer now, friendlier, as if they had recognized a kindred spirit. She didn't go back down to the living quarters that night. She spread her blankets on the floor of the lantern room, right at the base of the great lens, and lay there, looking up at the stars wheeling slowly overhead. The wind sang its lullaby around the tower. The sea provided a deep, rhythmic bass, and the lens above her, silent and still, seemed to gather all of the sounds and soften them, wrapping her in a cocoon of peaceful sound. She slept more deeply than she had ever slept in her life. The days that followed fell into a gentle, natural rhythm. She would wake with the sun, make tea and eat bread or the fish that Silas sometimes left in a small basket by the jetty. She would write in her notebooks, filling page after page with the stories she had heard in the Whisper Room. She would explore the island, finding new coves, new tide pools, new paths through tough, wiry grass. She would watch the seabirds, gannets plunging into the sea like white arrows, puffins with their comical, brightly colored beaks, gulls squabbling over scraps of seaweed, and every evening as dusk fell, she would climb to the Whisper Room and listen. She heard stories of love and loss, of hope and despair, of great adventures and quiet contentment. She heard the voices of keepers long dead, of sailors far at sea, of the island's first inhabitants, of the creatures of the deep. The room became her classroom, her library, her sanctuary. One evening, as the first snow of the year began to fall, dusting the island in a soft white blanket, she heard a new voice. It was different from the others. It was closer, more personal, and it spoke in a language she knew in her bones, but had never consciously learned. It was the voice of her grandmother, Elara. "Child of my heart," the voice whispered, carried on a breath of wind that seemed to curl specifically around her ear. "You have found it. You have found the place where the world speaks. I knew you would. I left you the map in my stories, and you followed it true." "Grandma," Elara whispered back, her eyes filling with tears. "I hear you. I hear you." "Of course you can," the voice chuckled, a warm, familiar sound. "You're in the Whisper Room. Oh, everyone can hear everyone here. That's the whole point. Now listen to me, child. I didn't bring you here just to listen to old stories. I brought you here because you have your own stories to tell. The world doesn't just need listeners. It needs voices. It needs new stories to add to the great conversation." "But what stories do I have to tell?" Elara asked. "I'm just me. I haven't done anything. I haven't been anywhere." "But you've been here," her grandmother's voice said gently. "That's enough. You've lived. You've loved. You've lost. You found your way back. That's a story. Tell it. Tell it. Tell it to the sea. Tell it to the wind. Tell it to the stars. And tell it to the people who need to hear it, the ones who are lost, the ones who are lonely, the ones who have forgotten how to listen. Your voice can be their lighthouse, Elara, just as the Seraphina's light guided ships through the darkness. Your stories can guide souls through their own inner storm." The voice faded, leaving behind only the familiar sounds of the sea and wind. But Elara's heart was pounding. She understood now. Her grandmother hadn't just sent her to find the Whisper Room. She had sent her to find her own voice. That night, she didn't just listen. For the first time, she told her own story. She told the Whisper Room about her childhood, about the grandmother who had sung to her in a forgotten language. She told it about her parents, distant and distracted, who had never really understood her. She told it about her loneliness in the city, her search for something she couldn't name, her desperate need for connection. She told it about finding the cobalt sea glass, about the peace she had felt in this very room. She poured her entire self into the stone chamber, holding nothing back, and when she was finished, she felt lighter than she had ever felt, as if she had been carrying a great weight all her life and had only now set it down. The sea responded with a gentle, approving sigh. The wind hummed a soft melody of acceptance. The stars twinkled a little brighter through the slit window. She was home. Not just on the island, but in herself. The winter on the island was long and quiet. Snow piled up against the base of the lighthouse, sometimes so deep that she had to dig her way out of the door. The sea turned gray and angry, crashing against the cliffs with thunderous force. Some days, the wind was so strong that she couldn't open the door at all, and she stayed inside the living quarters, huddled by the stove, writing by lamplight. Silas couldn't make the crossing for weeks at a time, and she learned to live on stored provisions, to stretch her supplies, to be grateful for every small mercy. But she was never lonely. She had her notebooks, filled with the stories she had heard, and the stories she was now telling. She had the Whisper Room, where she went every evening, no matter how cold or stormy, to listen and to speak. And she had the company of the island itself, its rhythms and moods becoming as familiar to her as her own breath. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, with days of soft rain and pale sunshine, and the first brave shoots of green pushing through the thawing ground. The seabirds returned, filling the cliffs with their raucous calls. The sea calmed, turning back to its deep indigo blue, and one day Silas's dory appeared on the horizon, a small dark speck on the glittering water. He brought supplies, flour, tea, candles, a letter from no one, and he brought a visitor. The visitor was a young man, about Elara's age, with kind eyes and wind-tangled hair, the color of sand. He introduced himself as Finian, a map maker, but not of land. He mapped the stars. He had heard, through the strange word-of-mouth network that connected lighthouse keepers and sailors and island dwellers, that there was someone on the Seraphina who listened to the stories of the world. He had come to ask if she would listen to his. Elara hesitated at first. Her island, her sanctuary, her whisper room, they were hers, but she remembered her grandmother's words. Your voice can be their lighthouse. And wasn't this what she had meant? That the stories were not meant to be hoarded, but shared? She led him up the path, showed him the living quarters, made him tea, and as dusk fell, she took him up the winding stairs, through the lantern room, and down into the whisper room. His face, when he first heard the voices of the sea and wind and stars, was a thing of wonder. His eyes grew wide, his mouth fell open, and tears streamed down his cheeks. He listened for a long time, just as she had done that first night, and then, in a voice rough with emotion, he began to tell his own story. He told of his father, a sailor who had navigated by the stars, who had taught Finian their names and their stories. He told of his father's last voyage, a journey from which he never returned, his ship lost in a storm far from any shore. He told of his own desperate search for meaning, his decision to map the stars not as cold, distant points of light, but as living things, as the final companions his father had seen before he died. He told of his loneliness, his grief, his struggle to find a place in a world that seemed to have no place for him. Elara listened, and when he was finished, she told him her own story. They sat in the whisper room, two lost souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of places, sharing their stories with the ancient, listening world. Something shifted between them that night. It was more than friendship, more than the camaraderie of shared experience. It was a recognition, a deep and profound understanding that they were two halves of the same story. When they finally climbed out of the whisper room, the stars seemed brighter than ever before, and the sea sang a song of welcome. Finian stayed on the island for 3 days. They explored together, walked the cliffs, sat by tide pools, cooked meals over the stove, and every evening they went to the whisper room, listening and telling, adding their voices to the great eternal conversation. On the 3rd day, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, he asked her a question. Would you mind, he said, his voice hesitant, if I came back? Not just as a visitor. I could build a small place down by the cove. I could map the stars from here, where they're so clear, and we could listen together. Elara looked at him, at his kind eyes and hopeful face. He looked at the lighthouse, her Seraphina, standing tall and eternal against the darkening sky. She thought of her grandmother, of the whisper room, of all the stories she had heard and told, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was how the story was meant to continue. Not alone, but together. Not just listening, but sharing. Yes, she said, her voice soft but clear. I think the island would like that. I know I would. And so it began. Finian returned, and with Silas's help, he built a small, sturdy cottage in the sheltered cove, on the leeward side of the island. He set up his instruments there, his telescopes and star charts, and spent his nights mapping the celestial bodies, listening to their faint, distant whispers. Elara stayed in the lighthouse, keeping the living quarters warm and welcoming, filling her notebooks with stories. And every evening, as dusk fell, they would meet in the whisper room. They would sit together in the tiny stone chamber, wrapped in blankets, and they would listen. They heard the stories of the sea, the wind, the stones, the stars. They heard the voices of the past, the keepers and sailors and island folk who had come before, and they told their own stories, the small daily stories of life on the island, and the larger stories of their heart. Sometimes they would whisper to each other, their voices barely audible, and the room would carry their words out into the world, weaving them into the great tapestry of sound. Elara would whisper her love for Finian, and the sea would carry it to the farthest shores. Finian would whisper his dreams for their future, and the wind would scatter them among the stars. Years passed. The island became their world, and the whisper room became its heart. Elara's notebooks multiplied, filling shelves in the living quarters, chronicling not just the stories of the past, but the story of their present, their life together on this wild, beautiful, listening island. Finian's star maps became renowned among astronomers, not for their scientific precision, though they were precise, but for the stories they told, the way they captured not just the positions of the stars, but their voices, their songs, their ancient, whispering tales. Visitors came sometimes. Delas would bring them in his story. Lost souls, seekers, people who had heard rumors of a place where the world spoke. Elara and Finian would welcome them, give them tea, and as dusk fell, lead them to the whisper room. They would watch the visitors' faces transform as they heard the voices for the first time, would sit with them as they poured out their own stories, would hold them as they wept, and then they would send them back to the mainland, changed, lighter, carrying a new story within them. The cobalt sea glass remained on the windowsill in the living quarters, and the lavender piece joined it. Over the years, other pieces were added, a shard of emerald green found by Finian on the beach, a sliver of sunrise pink that Silas brought from the mainland, a tiny chip of deepest black that Elara found in the whisper room itself, as if the stones had given her a piece of their own ancient heart. The great lens in the lantern room never lit again. It didn't need to. The Seraphina's light was no longer in its tower, but in its foundation. It was in the stories that were told and heard, in that tiny stone chamber. At its peak, it was in the love that grew between the two keepers of the whispers. It was in the peace that settled over every visitor who crossed its threshold. One evening, many years later, when Elara's hair had turned the color of sea foam, and Finian's face was etched with the fine lines of 1,000 smiles, they sat in the whisper room as they always did. The sea was calm, whispering softly. The wind was gentle, humming a lullaby. The stars were just beginning to appear through the slit window, their faint voices joining the chorus. Elara leaned her head against Finian's shoulder. "Connie, do you think," she whispered, "that we've said everything there is to say? That the room has heard all our story?" Finian smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I don't think that's possible. Every day is a new story. Every breath is a new word. We'll never run out." As if in agreement, the sea sighed, the wind murmured, and the stars twinkled a little brighter. The whisper room, that tiny chamber of stone and silence and sound, held them in its ancient embrace, adding their whispers to its eternal collection. And somewhere, far away, a young woman on a train pressed a piece of cobalt sea glass to her ear and smiled, hearing, just for a moment, the faint echo of a love story being told by the sea. The story of the Seraphina was not over. It would never be over. Only, as long as there was a sea to whisper and a wind to sing and a heart to listen, the story would continue, winding its way through time like the spiral staircase in the tower, always rising, always turning, always leading back to that small sacred space where the world spoke and the soul answered. And the soul answered. And so, dear listener, as you drift now on the edge of sleep, know that you too have a whisper room. It is the quiet place within you, the chamber of your own heart, where the world's stories meet your own. You can go there anytime you wish. Simply close your eyes, take a deep breath, and listen. Listen to the rhythm of your breath, the gentle tide of your pulse. Listen beneath the noise of the day, beneath the clamor of thoughts, to the deep abiding silence that holds you. And in that silence, you will hear it, the whisper of your own true story, waiting to be told. Sleep well, dear friend. Sleep deep, and may your dreams be filled with the sound of the sea, the song of the wind, and the peace of the whisper room. Good night. The seasons turned their eternal wheel, and the island remained, a fixed point in a changing world. Elara and Finian grew old together in the shelter of the Seraphina, their lives woven into the fabric of the place as intricately as the lichen on the stone. They became as much a part of the island's story as the keepers who had come before, their voices now joining the chorus that whispered from the ancient wall. In the summers, the island was alive with color. The sea pinks bloomed in drifts of soft magenta along the cliffs, and the grass grew thick and green, swaying in the warm breezes like waves upon a meadow. Visitors came more frequently then, brought by Silas and later by his son, a quiet young man named Caleb, who had inherited his father's love of silence and the sea. They came from distant cities, from nearby towns, from across the ocean sometimes. People who had heard, through the strange word-of-mouth network that connected the lost and the seeking, that there was a place where the world still spoke. Elara and Finian welcomed them all. They had built a small guest cottage near the lighthouse, a simple stone structure with a turf roof and windows that faced the sea. Visitors would stay for a few days, sometimes a week, learning the rhythm of the island, learning to be still. And every evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Elara or Finian would lead them up the winding stairs, through the lantern room, and down into the whisper room. They never stayed with the visitors during their first visit to the room. That was a private thing, a first meeting between a soul and the voice of the world. They would wait in the lantern room above, watching the stars emerge, listening to the muffled sounds of weeping, or laughter, or sometimes just long, profound silence that drifted up through the open trapdoor. And when the visitors emerged, their faces were always changed, lighter, softer, somehow more real. One such visitor was an old woman named Margot, who came into the island in the twilight of her own life. She was small and bird-like, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that had been worn rough by years of unshed tears. She had been a keeper of stories too, she told them, but not like Elara. She had been a librarian in a great city, surrounded by millions of books, by stories stacked on shelves like bricks in a wall. She had spent her life organizing them, cataloging them, preserving them, but she had never, she confessed, truly listened to them. On her last evening, after her third visit to the Whisper Room, she sat with Elara and Finian in the living quarters, drinking tea by the light of the kerosene lamp. Her eyes were red-rimmed but peaceful. "I heard my mother," she said softly. "She died when I was 12. I thought I had forgotten her voice, but it was there, in the room, waiting for me. She told me she was proud of me. She told me to stop being afraid." Elara reached across the table and took her hand. "The room gives us what we need," she said. "Not always what we want, but always what we need." Margot nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her weathered cheek. "I understand now," she said. "All those books, all those stories, they weren't just words on paper. They were voices, and I never listened. I just shelved them." "You can listen now," Finian said gently. "It's never too late." Margot left the next morning, clutching a small piece of sea glass that Elara had given her, a shard of pale amber, the color of old honey. She wrote to them every year after that, on the anniversary of her visit, until the letters stopped coming. But her story remained, woven into the walls of the whisper room. Another voice in the eternal chorus. The winters grew harder as the years passed. The snows came earlier and stayed longer, and the sea turned fierce and gray, pounding the cliffs with a fury that shook the very foundations of the lighthouse. Then winters. They were completely cut off for months, with no visits from Caleb and his boat, only the howling wind and the crashing waves for company. But they were never lonely. They had each other, and they had the whisper room. On the coldest nights when the wind screamed around the tower like 1,000 grieving souls, they would wrap themselves in every blanket they owned and climb to the tiny stone chamber. There, sheltered from the storm, they would listen. The sea's voice was different in winter, but it was louder, more urgent, filled with the stories of ships that had foundered and sailors who had drowned. The wind's song was a keen, a lament for all the lives lost to the deep. Even the stones seemed to groan under the assault of the elements, their ancient voices rumbling with the memory of ice ages and earthquakes, of worlds born and destroyed. But woven through all of this darkness was a thread of light. The stars, in winter, were clearer and brighter than at any other time, their voices cutting through the tumult like beams from a celestial lighthouse. They spoke of constancy, of endurance, of the slow, patient turning of the universe. They reminded Elara and Finian, huddled together in their tiny sanctuary, that they were part of something vast and eternal, that their small lives were threads in a tapestry too immense to comprehend. One winter night, when the wind was at its fiercest, and the sea was pounding the cliffs with a violence that seemed personal, Finian turned to Elara in the whisper room. His face, illuminated by the single candle they had brought, was etched with a tenderness that took her breath away. "Do you remember," he whispered, "the first time I came here? How you hesitated to let me in?" Elara smiled, the memory warm in her heart. "I was afraid," she admitted, "afraid that sharing this place would somehow diminish it. That if I let someone else in, it wouldn't be mine anymore. And now, oh, Sadie." She looked around the tiny stone chamber, at the walls that held the voices of centuries, at the slit window through which the stars were visible even now, at the man who had shared her life for so many years. "Now I understand that sharing it only makes it stronger. Every voice adds to the story. Every listener becomes part of the chorus." Finian nodded, his eyes shining in the candlelight. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about the future, about what happens when we're gone." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They were both old now, their bodies worn by years of island living, their faces mapped with the lines of 1,000 smiles and 1,000 storms. They had talked about death before, in the abstract, but never about what would come after. "The room will remain," Elara said firmly. "The island will remain. The sea and the wind and the stars will go on telling their stories. There will always be someone who needs to listen. But who will lead them here?" Finian asked. "Who will welcome them, make them tea, show them the way up the stairs?" It was a question that had no easy answer. Caleb the boatman was a good man, but he was not a keeper of stories. He was a carrier, a ferryman between worlds, but he did not live in either one. The visitors who came were seekers, not dwellers. They came, they listened, they left. None had ever stayed, until, of course, one did. Her name was Isla, and she arrived on a soft summer evening, when the sea was the color of lavender, and the air was thick with the scent of honey from the heather that bloomed on the cliff. She was young, barely out of her teens, with hair the color of dark honey, and eyes the gray-green of the sea before a storm. She came alone, in a small boat she had rowed herself from the mainland, and when Caleb tried to help her tie up at the jetty, she waved him away with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had learned to rely on no one but herself. Elara watched from the lighthouse door as the girl climbed the path. There was something familiar about her, something in the way she moved, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she paused halfway up to look back at the sea, as if saying goodbye to something she might never see again. "Who is she?" Finian asked, coming to stand beside Elara. "I don't know," Elara said, "but I think I've been waiting for her." As I reached the door and stood before them, slightly breathless from the climb. Up close, her eyes were remarkable. Not just grey-green, but flecked with gold, like sunlight on deep water. She held herself with a stillness that was rare in one so young. A stillness that spoke of long practice. "My grandmother told me about this place," she said, her voice soft but clear. "She came here once, many years ago. She said it changed her life. She said that if I ever felt lost, I should come here and listen." Elara's heart gave a sudden lurch. "Your grandmother," she said carefully. "What was her name?" "Margot," Isla said. "Not Margot Shan. She died last year. She left me this." She held out her hand, and in her palm lay a small piece of sea glass, pale amber, the color of old honey. Elara felt tears spring to her eyes. She reached out and took the glass, turning it over in her fingers. It was warm from Isla's skin, smooth as silk. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember your grandmother. She sat in that very chair, drinking tea, telling us about her mother's voice." His composure cracked, just slightly, a flicker of pain crossing her features before she smoothed it away. "She never stopped talking about this place," she said. "About you. About the room where the world speaks. When she died, I knew I had to come. I didn't know why. I just knew." Elara looked at Finian, and in his eyes she saw the same understanding that was dawning in her own. This girl was not just a visitor. She was not just another seeker passing through. She was the next chapter, the continuation of the story. That evening, Elara took Isla to the whisper room herself. They climbed the winding stairs together, Elara moving slowly now, her old bones protesting the effort, but refusing any help. The lantern room was bathed in the golden light of sunset, the great lens casting tiny rainbows across the floor. Elara knelt with difficulty and opened the small trapdoor. "Go down," she said gently. "Stay as long as you need. I'll be waiting up here." Hesitated at the edge of the dark opening. "What will I hear?" she asked. "Whatever you need to hear," Elara said. "That's the only promise the room makes." Isla climbed down, and Elara settled herself on the floor of the lantern room, her back against the pedestal of the great lens, and waited. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and violet. The stars emerged, one by one, like candles being lit in a vast, dark cathedral. And still she waited, listening to the faint, muffled sounds that drifted up through the open trapdoor. She heard weeping first, great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of the girl's soul. Then silence, long and profound. Then, faintly, the sound of I's voice, speaking in tones too low to make out words, but carrying a melody of confession, of release, of surrender. And finally, silence again, but a different kind of silence now, a silence of peace, a silence of arrival. When Isla finally climbed back up, her face was streaked with tears, but luminous with something Elara recognized. It was the look of someone who had been found, someone who had come home. "He was there," Isla whispered, her voice raw. "My grandmother, she was there. She told me everything. About my mother, who I never knew. About my father who left. About why I always felt so alone. She told me it wasn't my fault. She told me I was loved." Elara opened her arms, and the girl collapsed into them, weeping again, but softly now, the tears of relief rather than grief. They stayed like that for a long time, two women holding each other in the rainbow-lit lantern room, while the stars wheeled overhead, and the sea whispered its eternal lullaby below. Isla stayed on the island. It wasn't a decision she made consciously. It simply happened, the way a river eventually finds the sea. She helped with the visitors, learning the rhythms of welcome and guidance. She sat with Elara and Finian in the evenings, listening to their stories, adding her own. She explored every corner of the island, and in doing so, discovered corners of herself she had never known existed. She was particularly drawn to the tide pools, those small self-contained worlds at the edge of the sea. She would spend hours there, crouched on the rocks, watching the tiny dramas of anemones and crabs and periwinkles. She began to keep her own notebooks, not of stories, but of observations, of the small, intricate details of life on the edge of the world. She drew pictures too, delicate, precise sketches of shells and seaweed, and the faces of seabirds. You have the eye of a scientist and the heart of a poet, Finian told her one day, looking over her shoulder at her latest drawing. That's a rare combination. Aya smiled, a shy, pleased smile. I don't know what I am, she admitted. I just know that here, I don't have to be anything. I can just be. That, Elara said from her chair by the stove, is the greatest gift the island gives. The permission to simply exist. The years passed more quickly now, as years do when they are filled with contentment. Elara and Finian grew frailer, their movements slower, their need for rest greater, but they still climbed to the whisper room every evening, though now they leaned on each other, and sometimes on Isla, who had become as indispensable to them as breathing. On a soft spring evening, when the air was heavy with the scent of new growth, and the sea was calm as glass, Finian did not wake from his afternoon nap. Elara found him in their bed, a peaceful smile on his face, his hand reaching across the pillow towards where she always lay. He had gone, she knew, to the place where all stories end, and from which new stories begin. The grief was vast and terrible, a sea of sorrow that threatened to drown her, but she was a keeper of the whisper room. But she knew that grief too was a story, and that stories must be told. She climbed the tower alone that evening, leaning heavily on the wall, pausing on every step to catch her breath. She opened the trapdoor and lowered herself with Isla's help into the room, and there, in the tiny stone chamber that held the voice of the world, she told her grief. She told it to the sea, which answered with a gentle, consoling murmur. She told it to the wind, which wrapped around the tower like a comforting embrace. She told it to the stars, which burned bright and steady, reminding her that love does not end, only changes form. And she heard, woven through all the other voices, the voice of Finian, not sad, not lost, but peaceful, content, but waiting, oh waiting. I'll be here, his voice whispered, when you're ready. Oh, I'll be here. Oh. She stayed in the room until dawn, and when she emerged, she was changed. Not healed, some wounds never fully heal, but transformed. The grief was still there, but it was no longer a weight dragging her down. It was a part of her now, woven into the fabric of her being, adding depth and richness to her own story. She lived another 2 years after Finian's passing, with Isla as her constant companion and caretaker. They still welcomed visitors, though fewer now, and Isla did most of the guiding up the tower stairs. Elara spent more and more time in the whisper room, listening, always listening, to the voices of the ones she had loved and lost, and to the voices of the ones still to come. On her last night, she knew the time had come. She asked Isla to help her up the tower one final time. It took nearly an hour. The climb was so slow and painful, but she refused to be carried. She needed to make this journey on her own 2 feet, as she had made every journey in her life. In the whisper room, she sat against the curved stone wall, wrapped in the same patchwork quilt that had covered her on her first night on the island so many years ago. Isla sat beside her, holding her hand. "I'm going now," Elara said softly. "Finian is waiting, and my grandmother, and all the keepers who came before." Isla's eyes filled with tears, but she did not weep. She had learned, in her years on the island, that tears were not always sorrow. Sometimes they were gratitude. Sometimes they were love. "What do I do?" she whispered. "When you're gone, how do I keep this place? How do I know I'm doing it right?" Elara smiled, her face radiant even in the dim light. "You listen," she said. "That's all. You listen to the sea and the wind and the stars. You listen to the visitors, to their stories, to their grief and their joy. You listen to your own heart. The room will tell you the rest." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out 3 pieces of sea glass. The deep cobalt she had found on her first visit, the pale lavender that had appeared on the shelf, and the sunrise pink that Finian had given her so many years ago. She pressed them into Isla's hand. "These are for you," she said. "Keep them, add to them, pass them on when the time comes." Isla closed her fingers around the smooth, cool shards, feeling their weight, their history, their love. "I will," she promised. "I'll take care of them. I'll take care of this place." "I know you will," Elara said. She closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed. The sea whispered at the base of the cliffs. The wind sang softly around the tower. The stars, just beginning to appear through the slit window, twinkled their ancient, eternal light. "Listen," Elara murmured, her voice barely audible. "Can you hear them? All the voices, all the stories. They're beautiful." And then she was still, her face peaceful, a small smile on her lip. She had gone to join the chorus, her voice now one of the countless whispers that filled the room. Isla sat with her for a long time, holding her hand, listening. The sea's voice was gentle, consoling. The wind's song was soft, like a lullaby, and woven through them both, she heard new voices, Elara's and Finian's, and all the keepers who had come before. Their story is now complete, their whispers now eternal. When she finally climbed out of the whisper room, the sun was rising over the sea, painting the world in shades of gold and rose. She stood in the lantern room, the great lens silent and still, and looked out at the island that was now hers to tend. The grass swayed in the morning breeze. The seabirds wheeled and called. The sea stretched to the horizon, endless and eternal. He understood now what Elara had meant. The island was not a place to be owned. It was a place to be stewarded, a place to be listened to, a place to be loved. And she was ready. She had been ready, she realized, from the moment she had first set foot on its shores. She walked down the winding stairs, her hand trailing along the cold stone wall, feeling the echoes of all the footsteps that had come before. In the living quarters, she made tea and sat at the wooden table, the 3 pieces of sea glass arranged before her. She added them to the collection on the shelf, the cobalt, the lavender, the pink, and now the amber that had been her grandmother's, all resting together, a small rainbow of memory and love. Visitors would come. She would welcome them, make them tea, guide them up the stairs. They would sit in the whisper room and listen, and they would hear what they needed to hear, and some of them perhaps would leave a piece of themselves behind, adding their voices to the eternal chorus. The story of the Seraphim was not over. It would never be over. It would continue as long as there was a sea to whisper, and a wind to sing, and a heart to listen. It would continue through Isla, and through those who came after her, and through those who came after them. Each generation of keepers would add their own chapter, their own voice, their own love. And somewhere far away, in cities and towns and villages across the world, people would hold pieces of sea glass to their ears and hear, just for a moment, the faint echo of a story being told by the sea. They would remember that they were not alone, that they were part of something vast and ancient and eternal. They would remember that there is always a place where the world speaks, and that the only requirement for hearing it is the willingness to listen. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of this tale. But remember, it is only the end of this telling. The story itself goes on, winding through time like the spiral staircase in the tower, always rising, always turning, always leading back to that small, sacred space where the world speaks and the soul answers. As you drift now towards sleep, let the image of the Seraphina fill your mind. See its pale stone tower against the indigo sky. Hear the gentle shush of the sea against the cliff. Feel the cool, salt-scented air on your skin, and know that somewhere, in a tiny room at the top of that tower, your own voice is waiting to be heard. Your own story is waiting to be told. You don't need to travel to a distant island to find your whisper room. It is within you, always. It is the quiet place at the center of your being, the chamber of your own heart, where the noise of the world cannot reach. You can go there anytime you wish. Simply close your eyes. Take a deep, slow breath. And listen. Listen to the rhythm of your breath, the gentle tide of your pulse. Listen beneath the thoughts, beneath the worries, beneath the plans and the memories and the endless chatter of the mind. Listen to the silence that holds it all, and in that silence you will hear it. The whisper of your own true self, waiting to be acknowledged. The whisper of your own deep peace, waiting to be felt. The whisper of your own eternal story, waiting to be lived. Sleep well, dear friends. Sleep deep, and let your dreams be filled with the sound of the sea, the song of the wind, and the peace of the whisperer room. May you wake refreshed, renewed, and ready to listen to the stories that await you in the new day. And know that whenever you need to return to this place of peace, you have only to close your eyes and remember. This is Sleep Tale Whispers, signing off for now. Thank you for letting me be your guide to the shores of sleep. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may the whispers carry you home. Good night. Good night.